Here we will draw the fundamental extra and intra-hippocampal circuitry. We begin with the extra-hippocampal circuitry, namely the PAPE circuit. First, in sagittal view, draw the following structures: the corpus callosum, cingulate gyrus, basal forebrain, thalamus, and parahippocampal gyrus with its anterior gyral fold, the uncus. Next, let's show the steps in the PAPE circuit. First, indicate that the entorhinal cortex in the anterior parahippocampal gyrus projects to the hippocampus, which projects via the fornix to the mammillary nuclei. Divide the fornix as follows. The crus of the fornix is its vertical ascent. The body of the fornix is its anterior projection underneath the corpus callosum, and the column of the fornix is its descent. Note that the fornix descends both anterior and posterior to the anterior commissure. The anterior projection is called the precommissural fornix, and the posterior projection through the hypothalamus, as shown here, is called the postcommissural fornix. Next, indicate that the mammillary nuclei project to the anterior thalamic nuclei via the mammillothalamic vesiculus, and then that the anterior thalamic nuclei project to the cingulate gyrus. Finally, show that the cingulate gyrus projects back to the entorhinal cortex via the cingulum to close the PAPE circuit loop. When James Pape introduced this circuit in 1937, he believed it played a fundamental role in emotional processing. However, now the PAPE circuit is known to be central to memory consolidation instead. Neuronal input reaches the hippocampus through widespread neocortical, limbic, diencephalic, and brainstem neurobehavioral areas. Here we will show two examples of how these areas reach the hippocampus. First, simply show that the cingulate gyrus has reciprocal connections with the neocortex that project via the cingulum to the entorhinal cortex, which then projects to the hippocampus. Next, indicate that widespread neocortical areas project to the posterior parahippocampal gyrus, which then projects to the perirhinal cortex and subsequently to the entorhinal cortex and on to the hippocampus. Note that although not shown as such here, many other areas skip forming a synapse in the posterior parahippocampal gyrus and directly synapse in the perirhinal or entorhinal cortices, or even directly in the hippocampus itself. Now let's draw the intrahippocampal circuitry, namely the perforant pathway. First, in coronal view, redraw the medial temporal lobe. Include the dentate gyrus, cornu ammonis, subiculum, entorhinal cortex, alveus, and fimbria. Then add the posterior length of the hippocampus. Show that the fimbria becomes the crus of the fornix, which makes its vertical ascent at the splenium of the corpus callosum. The intrahippocampal circuitry is distinct in that it follows a very specific unidirectional progression, unlike most of the cortex, which has bidirectional connections. Show that the entorhinal cortex projects through the subiculum, it perforates it, to synapse in the dentate gyrus. Then indicate that the dentate gyrus projects to CA3, which projects to CA1 via Schaffer collaterals. CA1 then projects to the subiculum, which projects along the alveus to the fimbria, which passes posteriorly and becomes the crus of the fornix. The fornix ultimately projects, most notably, to the mammillary nuclei. Finally, show that the subiculum also projects back to the entorhinal cortex. Note that CA3 and CA1 also send direct projections to the fimbria that skip the intervening steps in this pathway, and also note that many other intrahippocampal projections also exist, including subiculum projections to the other components of the subicular complex, meaning the presubiculum and the parasubiculum. Lastly, consider that because of the well-studied anatomical relationship between the entorhinal cortex, dentate gyrus, cornu ammonis, and subiculum, these structures are often collectively referred to as the hippocampal formation. This concludes our diagram.